For centuries, a single version of the Christian faith was presented as absolute truth. But, what if that truth was built on silence, omissions, and human decisions? Throughout history, some texts were accepted, others rejected, and some were simply erased. Not because they lacked importance, but because they threatened the structure of religious power. There are ancient scriptures, forbidden versions of the Bible, and manuscripts excluded from the canon that tell a very different story from the one taught from the pulpit. A story that challenges central doctrines, redefines the concept of salvation, and exposes what many would call the greatest lie ever told to Christianity. Who decided what was the Word of God and what should be forgotten? Why did certain texts disappear? And what happens when we compare the official Bible with what was censored? In this documentary, you will discover the forbidden Bible, the rejected texts, the hidden truths, and the reason these revelations were never meant to reach you. Before continuing, subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and share your comment. This helps this content reach more people and strengthens our community of investigation, history, and awareness. Now, get ready, because after this, your view of Christianity will never be the same. In some manuscript preserved in the mountains of Ethiopia, there is a phrase that should disturb any person familiar with traditional Christianity. It says that 200 angels descended from heaven, not to help humanity, but to deliberately corrupt it. These angels took human women, taught forbidden secrets, and generated a race of giants that devastated the earth. The strangest thing is that this account does not come from some lost heretical text. It is part of the official Bible of a Christian country. We are talking about the Ethiopian Bible, specifically the Book of Enoch, a text that survived complete only in the DOESN language, and that to this day is considered sacred scripture by the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. While the rest of the Christian world rejected this book more than 1,500 years ago, the Ethiopians maintained it as an essential part of their faith. And perhaps they have a good reason for this. The story begins with a simple question that few ask. Why does the Epistle of Jude, which is in any Christian's Bible, explicitly quote a prophecy from Enoch? The passage is clear. Jude 14 and 15 reproduce almost word for word a passage that only exists in the Book of Enoch. How is it possible that the New Testament makes direct reference to a book that would later be banned from the biblical canon? This is not just an academic curiosity, it is a crack in the official account. If Jude considers Enoch a reliable enough source to be quoted in a letter that would come to be part of the New Testament, what happened for this same book to later be considered inadequate for Christians? The answer may lie in the content of the Book of Enoch itself. The first chapters narrate something that conflicts directly with fundamental pillars of Christianity, as it was systematized in the councils of the 4th and 5th centuries. According to the text, evil in the world does not arise primarily from Adam and Eve's disobedience, as the traditional doctrine of original sin teaches. Instead, corruption comes from a previous and much more dramatic cosmic interference. The account is specific. 200 angels called Watchers, who had been designated by God to observe humanity, decide to break the celestial rules. They descend to Mount Hermon, make a joint oath, and take human women as wives, but this is only the beginning. These angels begin to teach humans knowledge that, according to the text, should not have been revealed. Azazel teaches the manufacture of weapons and armor. Semyaza reveals enchantments and the cutting of roots. Armoros teaches the breaking of enchantments. Barakel transmits astrology. Kokabel explains the signs of the stars. Tamiel reveals the secrets of astronomy. And Asradel teaches about the phases of the moon. Each angel specializes in corrupting a specific area of human knowledge. The result of this forbidden education is catastrophic. The children of these angels with human women, the Nephilim, become giants that consume everything the earth produces. When this is not enough, they begin to devour humans themselves and even one another. Violence spreads. The earth becomes saturated with blood, and humanity's cries rise to the heavens. Up to this point, the narrative is already problematic enough for any theology that wants to maintain responsibility for evil, centered on human choice. But the Book of Enoch goes further. It presents God reacting to this situation in a way that challenges the image of perfect omniscience. The text suggests that the Watcher's rebellion caught the Creator himself by surprise, forcing him to improvise a response. The divine solution is drastic. God sends other angels, those who remained faithful, to imprison the rebel Watchers and cleanse the earth through the flood. But there is a disturbing detail. Before being imprisoned, the fallen angels reveal even more secrets, including what the text calls eternal mysteries that were not destined for humans. This specific point creates an immense theological paradox. If angels can sin, if they can make decisions that contradict divine will, and if they can corrupt creation, then the entire hierarchical structure of the traditional Christian universe collapses. Angels are no longer perfect and obedient messengers. They are beings with their own free will, capable of destructive choices. But there is something even more unsettling in this narrative. The Book of Enoch not only describes corruption, it also suggests that part of the knowledge transmitted by the fallen angels may have been beneficial for humanity. Metallurgy, astronomy, medicine, all these arts appear as ambiguous gifts, useful but dangerous coming from a corrupted source. This raises a question that no simple theology can easily resolve. What if human progress, including technologies that save lives, comes partially from knowledge, obtained through transgression? What to do with the possibility that not all human advancement is a clear and direct blessing from God? We begin to understand why this text could be problematic for a church that sought doctrinal uniformity. When Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire in the 4th century, the need for clear hierarchy, centralized authority, and controllable cosmology became state policy. A universe where angels can rebel, where knowledge has ambiguous origins, and where the very celestial order is not perfectly stable, presents serious problems for any institution that needs certainties. And it is exactly at this point that the Ethiopian preservation of the Book of Enoch becomes more than a historical curiosity. It becomes evidence that primitive Christianity was significantly different from what prevailed in the West. Ethiopia, linguistically and geographically isolated from the disputes of Roman Mediterranean, maintained a version of Christianity that predates many of the canonical decisions that defined faith as we know it today. Historical records suggest that Christianity arrived in Ethiopia very early, possibly in the 1st century, through commercial routes that connected the Red Sea to the African interior. When travelers like Cosmas Indicopleustes visited the country in Nat Yamau, the 6th century, they found an already consolidated Christian tradition, but with characteristics distinct from those that prevailed in the rest of the Christian world. What makes this particularly significant is that the Ethiopian Bible does not only include the Book of Enoch, it includes 81 books in total, compared to the 66 of most Protestant Bibles, or the 73 of the Catholic Bible. This means that the Ethiopians preserved texts that were lost, rejected, or deliberately excluded in other Christian traditions. But why exactly did the Book of Enoch become such a big problem that it needed to be removed from Western Christian tradition? The answer lies not only in the text content, but in the historical moment when this decision was made. In the 4th century, when Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire, the church faced challenges that went far beyond pure theology. Imagine the situation. You have a vast empire, diverse populations, dozens of different Christian traditions, each with their own texts, practices, and interpretations. How do you unify all this under central authority? How do you maintain doctrinal control over millions of people scattered from Britain to Egypt? The Roman response was characteristic: standardization, hierarchy, and elimination of problematic elements. And the Book of Enoch was profoundly problematic for this project, not only because its ideas were complicated, but because they undermined the very possibility of institutional control over faith. If angels can rebel against God, if knowledge can come from corrupted sources, if the very celestial order is not perfectly stable, how can an earthly church claim absolute authority over spiritual matters? There are indications that this concern was very real for Christian leaders of the time. Preserved documents from the councils of the 4th century show a growing obsession with orthodoxy, uniformity, and discipline. The Council of Nicaea in 325, followed by the Council of Constantinople in 381, were not only dealing with resolving abstract theological disputes, they were establishing the foundations of a church that could function as an imperial institution. In this context, texts like the Book of Enoch represented more than heresy. They represented indiscipline, a cosmology where angels can make independent decisions, where evil has multiple and complex origins, where God himself sometimes seems to react to events rather than control them perfectly, is a cosmology that does not serve the purposes of an imperial church. But there is something even more specific that makes Enoch's exclusion revealing. The text not only presents an alternative origin for evil, it offers an alternative explanation for human suffering that removes blame from individuals and places it on greater cosmic forces. If humanity's problems come mainly from the interference of rebel angels, not from Adam and Eve's choice, then the entire structure of Christian individual salvation needs to be rethought. The doctrine of original sin, formulated mainly by Augustine of Hippo in the late 4th and early 5th centuries, depended fundamentally on the idea that evil enters the world through human disobedience. This interpretation had an obvious political advantage. It placed moral responsibility directly on individuals and their choices, creating the need for an institution that could offer forgiveness and spiritual guidance. The Book of Enoch complicated this narrative by suggesting that much of the evil in the world came from sources that were completely beyond human control. How do you hold people responsible for conditions that were created by the rebellion of celestial beings? How do you maintain the urgent need for individual salvation if a significant part of the problem resides in a cosmic corruption prior to humanity? Records of theological debates from that time suggest that these questions were not purely academic. Christian groups that maintained traditions close to the Book of Enoch tended to develop different religious practices, less centered on episcopal authority and more focused on direct spiritual experiences. Some emphasized personal revelations, others developed complex mystical traditions that escaped institutional control. And it is here that Ethiopian preservation becomes even more significant. Ethiopia not only maintained the Book of Enoch, it developed an entire Christian tradition that functioned perfectly well with these problematic ideas. The Ethiopian church created its own hierarchies, its own systems of authority, its own practices of salvation, all this including texts that the West considered impossible to manage. Reports from European missionaries who visited Ethiopia in the 16th and 17th centuries describe a robust and sophisticated Christian religiosity, but with characteristics that seemed strange to visitors. The Ethiopians had different liturgical practices, different religious calendars, and, most importantly, an understanding of the Christian cosmos that included elements that had been eliminated from Western tradition centuries before. This suggests something disturbing. Perhaps the exclusion of the Book of Enoch was not necessary to preserve the Christian faith, but only to preserve a specific type of Christianity that better served the purposes of Roman imperial power. Ethiopia proves that it was possible to have a complete, functional, and lasting Christian tradition, including these problematic texts. But there is another aspect of this story that deserves attention. When modern scholars finally began to examine the Book of Enoch in the 18th and 19th centuries, after centuries of forgetfulness in the West, they discovered something surprising. Many elements of traditional Christian demonology, ideas about fallen angels, demonic hierarchies, origins of evil, had their roots exactly in the texts that had been excluded from the canon. In other words, Western Christianity had formally rejected the Book of Enoch, but informally absorbed many of its ideas through other sources. The difference is that these ideas arrived in fragmented form, without the original narrative context, and were reinterpreted to serve official theology. The result was a demonology that maintained the dramaturge elements of the original text, but without its theological complexity. This raises an uncomfortable question about the formation of Christian tradition. How many other ideas were absorbed in a similar way? How many elements of current Christian faith come from texts that were officially rejected, but that continued influencing tradition through indirect channels? The answer may lie in the very text that survived. When you read the New Testament with knowledge of the Book of Enoch, certain passages begin to make sense differently. References to principalities and powers, mentions of angels who did not keep their principality, allusions to giants and sons of God. All this gains new dimension when you know the complete narrative context that was preserved only in Ethiopia. And perhaps that is exactly what makes the Ethiopian Bible so revealing. It is not just an archive of ancient texts. It is a window into a Christianity that could have been, a Christianity that included questions that were deliberately simplified or eliminated. It shows that the choices made by the councils of the 4th and 5th centuries were not inevitable but contingent, based on specific circumstances and particular political needs. What this means for contemporary Christians is a question that each person must answer for themselves. But the existence of the Ethiopian tradition poses at least one question that cannot be avoided. What if the version of Christianity that prevailed in the West was shaped as much by the needs of temporal power as by spiritual revelations? What if texts like the Book of Enoch were excluded not because they were false, but because they were inconvenient? The Ethiopian Church does not offer easy answers to these questions. It simply continues to exist, preserving texts that others discarded, maintaining traditions that others abandoned, reminding the Christian world that the choices made in the past were not the only possible ones. And perhaps in the end, this is the most important contribution of the Ethiopian Bible. Not revealing hidden secrets, but showing that the very idea of a monolithic and uniform Christianity is a historical construction, not a theological necessity.